Hi, everyone. I'm Jenny Hale. It's so nice to meet you all and be here virtually this evening to share this work with you all. I am just very passionate as a human being about having very meaningful and safe conversations with people in my life, whether it be for work, in the context of research, or just, in my relationships personally and professionally. And I think a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about this evening really goes into both of those categories. This is just good practices and best practices for how to interact with folks when you're having a conversation with the intent to really understand. And to give you a little bit of background around some of the inspiration for this work, there have been several instances throughout my career in conducting research and ethnographic research with a lot of different populations of folks. And sometimes things arise that we don't necessarily expect. And something that I think is important for human beings to think about when they are in situations that can be, potentially jarring or, unexpected, but in a negative way. We have a lot of different responses to perceived threats and when we feel unsafe. So everyone's aware of fight or flight. And, you can either fight or flee the scene. But there's two other ones that are fawning and freeze. So freeze is just like deer in the headlights, or, when you're just taken aback and you don't know what to do. Fawning is kind of more like playing possum, or if you see two dogs playing and, one of them might roll over and expose their stomach to show that they're being submissive and they don't want anything to escalate. So sometimes when we're in situations where we feel threatened or uncomfortable, we might freeze or we might exhibit some fawning. And then we might look back on that scenario and think, man, why didn't I shut that conversation down? Why didn't I do something different or say something different? So this guide is really to help people with some language and just kind of thinking through those scenarios of how you might play through something when it comes up and it takes you by surprise. The instance that I was informed about before I created this playbook was when a participant became very aggressive and very, very rude and inappropriate with a research team during a virtual interview. And we decided that, there needed to be some training because the interview went on longer than it should have because people didn't know what to do. They were just very taken aback. So I sincerely hope that this information that I share with you all today can help you navigate some tricky situations and make you feel more prepared to both create a safe space for yourself as a researcher and to create a safe space for your participants as you are hearing their testimony about their lived experience. So without further ado, I will get in here, and I will note that most of this is kind of geared towards virtual interviews and virtual research, but again, it applies to in-person ethnographic research as well. So this again is just about how to be, creating a safe space for folks, but also being empathetic and trauma informed, and being able to make space for emotionally heavy conversations and knowing how to address inappropriate behavior. And the thing to remember about, when we're talking to different folks in any kind of interview, no matter what type of research you're doing, anyone that you speak with may have experienced some type of trauma. It's more likely than not. They might say things that are unexpected or off topic. They might have a serious need or challenge in their life that they express to you. And, we have to be mindful of this when we're going into these conversations. I work in healthcare, so a lot of this stuff comes up in these conversations around healthcare, but this can come up in any context. So in being a trauma-informed researcher, this is something that we talk about in terms of clinicians and a lot of interactions that we have with anyone that's providing a human service. And that especially applies to us as researchers, because we are having in-depth conversations with people. So it's this approach that assumes that any individual is more likely than not to have a history of trauma. We all live in this world, we've all experienced things, and the magnitude of those things can differ for each person. What might feel very traumatic to someone may feel less traumatic to another. There's a spectrum and a scale there. But as researchers, we must be mindful that anything that we discuss with people could potentially be something serious or something triggering. So when we're thinking about the key tenets of conducting trauma-informed qualitative research, there are several kind of pillars that you really want to make sure that you're conveying to folks. So on transparency, it's helping people know what to expect. You really want to be transparent about things like, what's the purpose of your research? How long is this interview going to take? What are you going to talk about? If there's any, interactive activities, if you're giving an honorarium and incentivizing them for their time with you, how is that going to be delivered? In what form? When should they expect it? You want to, preface any kind of discussion topic before you dive into a question also. So, letting them know, we're going to talk about 4 things today. We're going to talk about technology, your experience being hospitalized, how you feel about being a caregiver, or, whatever the case may be, but make sure that you're really explicit around what is going to be discussed. And when you're finished with one section in your discussion guide, say, okay, we've finished talking about that. Now we're going to move on to this next topic. All of this is also very, very important in building rapport. I think everyone can think about an opposite scenario where they were on a phone call, potentially maybe with something like customer service, where they don't give you any inclination about what they're going to ask you, how long it's going to take, what's going to be expected. So for us, we really need to make sure that we are being very transparent about all of that, especially if we are going to record the interviews, notifying folks that you're going to be recording them audio or video, and then obtaining that informed consent before you start recording. So that's transparency. The second pillar is thinking about the relationship and power dynamic. So when you're thinking about that, any context and that we have with other people that we interact with, there could potentially be, some type of a power dynamic. And this is just human. It's, simple things and complex things. And it's things that we might be aware of consciously or subconsciously. If I'm a little vertically challenged, I might be intimidated if I'm speaking to someone who's very, very tall. There could be gender things like, if a man is asking me questions about something personal versus if a female is asking me questions about something very personal. So consider how your social identities and your experiences differ from your participant, and think about how that might play into how you can make them feel comfortable, because that's what this is all about. Creating a safe space is a new trendy way to say making people feel comfortable. So in the context of research, a lot of times we speak with people that are at different socioeconomic levels, different education levels. There's, white collar versus blue collar. And when you're thinking about these types of things, when you're going into an interview, you always want to make sure that you set the participant in a position of authority and expertise on their lived experience. You're here to be humble and to learn from them. They're here to be the expert and to be elevated as the expert. So there could be, potential intimidation around things like, oh, this person is college educated and I'm not. They, know more about my condition than I do. I'm always very, very cognizant to say that I am a researcher. I'm not a nurse or a doctor, because I do healthcare research. So I make sure that people know that I'm not in a position of authority. I'm here to learn from them, and mirroring their language is very important with that as well. So creating that connection and elevating them as being in the position of authority. The next one is autonomy. So before the interview begins, you really want to make sure that You are establishing clear communication around skipping questions to say, if there's anything that you don't feel comfortable asking or answering, just let me know and I'll move to the next question. That's a very key piece in starting an interview, that I'm here to learn from you. I'm here to honor your experience, and you're in the driver's seat on what you share with me. I'm in the driver's seat on the questions being asked, but if there's a question that you're not comfortable with, let me know and we'll move on. So it's a confidential and welcoming space. People, you want them to be able to just speak freely without any judgment of expectations or disclosing anything traumatic. And we'll go through kind of ways to detect if that's happening. Another thing in this one is just to avoid labeling anyone's experience. So if they indicate a preferred term, or they just start, talking about something in another term that maybe you're not used to using, go ahead and mirror their language. Don't correct them. Like an example would be, I don't know, let's say someone had a pacemaker and they called it their heart clicker. I would just mirror their language, and throughout the interview, I would ask them, okay, tell me more about your heart clicker. You mentioned something else about your heart clicker. Can you tell me more about that? I would not say, you mean your pacemaker? Because then that might, make them feel like they're being corrected, or they might not remember what the actual technical term. So just be mindful of that as well. Another key pillar here is this agility and flexibility. We've got to make sure that in the aims of psychological and emotional safety for the research team and the participant, you've got to be prepared for any kind of range of reaction, and then be flexible to make this interview positive for everyone involved. So, you can create space for connection, even in a professional capacity. If there are, folks that need to talk about something that is deeply personal that you're asking about, making sure that there's space for that real human connection. As researchers, we're not therapists. We don't provide clinical support. We don't have, we don't give advice, and we don't have interventions to offer, but we can still acknowledge people's experience and just, use active listening, use compassion, and use empathy. And, although we aren't clinicians and we are not licensed counselors or therapists, sometimes just listening to people and being a witness to their lived experience is all they need, just to be validated and to know that their experience and opinions, thoughts, and feelings are being heard and understood. That's a wonderful gift that we can give to the people that we interact with. And it's very, very important. And remembering that, we're all human beings. And as much as we are here to collect data and we're here to do a job, we're also here to be human. And another aspect of that is if people are, inappropriate in a human way. No one's perfect. People can be weird and they can be crazy, and you never know what's going to come up. So you've also got to be agile and flexible and shutting things down if you need to. So there's really kind of two elements to that agility and flexibility. It's, holding space for human connection, or setting boundaries and being able to let things drop if needed. So when you're thinking about trauma awareness, trauma is anything that's just a deeply disturbing experience. It's really not any more complicated than that. And anyone can experience it at any age. It's personal, it's individual, it's subjective. What's traumatic to me might not be traumatic to you. There's different levels of it. There's different types of it. I mean, you can go down rabbit holes on the internet learning about all the different types of trauma. Everyone processes it and deals with it, differently, but really just the main thing is to remember that anyone could potentially have some kind of trauma. And some things that may seem very innocent to you may be traumatic to someone. An example that I know of for research, in the context of research, is photographs and video. There are a lot of different reasons why people might be very uncomfortable about having their photograph taken or video recorded. So if that's essential to your research, I would definitely make sure that you get that information up front before you have people in your study, or consider just recording audio. there's a lot of different reasons behind that. Someone just, there might be a history of body dysmorphia or an eating disorder or something, or just something about their physical appearance that they're not comfortable with. You never know what the reason is, but that's something that, a lot of people are like, oh yeah, sure, take my picture. It seems simple and innocent. So just kind of think about anything could potentially be trauma. That's the point I'm trying to make here. For me in healthcare, doing this type of work, talking to people about recent hospitalizations, being caregivers, medical trauma is one of the types of trauma, and that's something that comes up a lot for me. But depending on your line of work and the type of conversations that you're having, it could be anything. Even if you're studying makeup and you're doing consumer research on foundation, just people's skin and acne, and that could be really emotionally traumatic to talk about that type of stuff. So really just remember, it could be anything. So as you're preparing for your interviews, you want to think about how you're going to build a trauma-informed research plan. And that can be thinking about your research goals, what you're planning to learn about. Does this population, thinking about like who you're going to speak with, does this population have anything in common that could potentially lead to that? For me in healthcare, they all have a major diagnosis. When I speak to Medicare members, a lot of times they've recently undergone a major life change. They've, went from working to being retired, or they moved to an assisted living space. Maybe they've recently been hospitalized. Maybe their spouse has recently been hospitalized. There's a myriad of things, but, think about ways that your research may touch on something that's potentially traumatic. And then how can your, research plan be mindful of that? So some tips on just being trauma informed and being prepared for anything to go off topic. You want to make sure that you always recruit additional participants for your research. That's just a best practice anyway. Some of them you might not get the data that you need. Some might end early, they might go off topic. It's okay if that happens, but it's definitely a best practice to go ahead and over recruit so that you have some cushion there. And the other thing that you want to think about is building a thoughtful screener. So this is, again, thinking about the context of your research before you go into the interviews. When you're determining who your participants are going to be, you want to go through those screener questions to see if there's anything else that you could potentially uncover there. Some of the screener questions might give you a clue that somebody might have trauma, but they're not necessarily going to touch on it. It's just for you to be mindful. So creating a mindful discussion guide, you definitely want to introduce your talking points early, like I mentioned before. Preface them. We finished talking about this. Now we're going to talk about that. Think about the content of your discussion guide and, really be flexible in how it's crafted. We always have to do this as researchers, potentially go off script. But if you notice that anyone's having a traumatic reaction or they're uncomfortable in any way, just pause and check in with yourself and, carefully phrase the question and say, ask, is it okay if I ask you about this? So as a moderator, you want to make sure that you are on the same page with your research team and that everyone is aware of what their role is in the interview. The moderator is the lead of the interview. You're there to steer the conversation, to be neutral, to actively listen, probe for clarity, lead with curiosity and compassion. You're going to have a scheduler and a recruiter to get your participants set up. You've got note takers and observers there to document everything. And then you have a tech check person to support your participant if you're doing virtual research, to make sure that they have everything that they need. And there should be a place where you can, speak to your research team in a secure location if you're doing virtual interviews, so that you can have a sidebar conversation with them as needed. But really, for the main purpose of this presentation, talking about creating a safe space, these are mantras I really love to use before I go into an interview. When I would do ethnographic research, before I would go into people's homes, I would either sit in my car, kind of stand at their door for a minute and say some of these things. I might say a prayer, I might set an intention. A lot of this is, learned skills, but a lot of it is also just human intuition and, putting yourself in the mind space of being a learner and honoring someone else. So, saying to yourself, it's a privilege to learn from this person's experience. My job here is to listen. My role in this interview is to ask thoughtful questions. I'm here to learn and steer the conversation. I'm here to hold space for this person's experience. I've reviewed the screener responses for the participants, so I'm showing up with as much context and awareness as possible. These are all things to really put yourself in the right mindset to be in that role of creating that safe space and making sure that your participant is in the position of safety and security to be able to be open and honest with you in their responses. So in between interviews, you want to give yourself time to debrief and decompress. We all have limits. You set breaks in between. I usually do 30 to 40 minutes. Make sure you know how many interviews you and your team can conduct in a day. Always be agile, think about the time that it might take for these interviews to pan out. You might need more breaks or processing time if it's a really touchy subject. We've had interview sprints where we've been working with folks that are talking about palliative care, and that was really emotionally heavy, and those interviews took longer. People just needed more time to process those conversations. So make sure that you take time to process and schedule breaks in between your interviews. And when you're actually conducting the interviews, you've got to balance the safety of the research team and the participants. And it's a balancing act, because I might have a participant that says something that might trigger you and might remind you of a traumatic experience that you've had. I've had interviews with caregivers, talking about watching their loved ones decline in health and deteriorate, and how difficult and challenging it is for them to extend that support and to watch someone that used to be so strong and capable in their life become so dependent and sickly, and how challenging that is for us with our loved ones. And I can relate to that deeply. And it's okay to show and express emotion in your interviews. I actually, with that participant, I've shed a few tears and shared tissues with folks, but I knew I was able to maintain my composure and move through the interview. And it was a way for me to build connection and be authentic and, share my human emotions and empathy with that person. But if you ever feel overwhelmed, it's okay to take a step back and remember to, you've got to put your own oxygen mask on first. So that's why we also have our research teams with us as backup, and you can lean on other folks to take over if you ever need to take a step back. And that's important to talk about all these things with your research team before you go into these interviews. So when you're thinking about setting the stage for informed consent, the beginning of the interview, that really sets the stage for building rapport. So you want to start off strong, and you want to be very clear with these people that you're talking to, that you are going to protect their information in whatever ways that you do. For me, I've got to protect PHI in healthcare, making sure that you're getting consent for recording, just making sure that you're being really clear about everything that you're doing and what your intentions are is very important. Creating a safe space for your participants is also about the balance with your research team, making sure that you ask, one question at a time. It should feel like a conversation with a friend. It should not feel like an interrogation. Don't, make it feel like a survey that you're just running through and you're trying to check off boxes. Be interested in this person and show them that you are really paying attention. And that's another way to, another reason why mirroring language is important as well. So for the research team dynamics, again, we talked already a lot about this with making sure that you can have space for your team to set boundaries. When you're with folks in virtual or in person, and you're sharing any logistics throughout the interviews, don't share any last names of people on your research team. Make sure that you have a strategy with your research team on how you're going to communicate and deal with things if anything comes up that is not ideal. And then again, building rapport. So here we go into kind of expecting the unexpected. So, you've done your best to create a safe space, and you come into a situation where people are either, really emotional, really inappropriate. You never know what the case may be. And when things go awry, you can improvise. So for the intent of safety, if an interview doesn't pan out, that's okay. And we talked about kind of that balance of if you need to hold space for someone or if you need to just set a boundary and let it go. A good way to kind of check in about this if you're talking with your research team is create these metaphors. So I came up with weather as a metaphor for gauging when conversations either get emotionally heavy or inappropriate or anyway. So there's a cloudy day, somebody might be emotional or distraught. It can be heavy, but there's no threat for safety there. Thunderstorm, it might be more tumultuous. There might be some danger, but it might not be severe. So they might, the person might be getting agitated or hostile, but you don't feel unsafe and you feel like maybe you can, get things back on track. So that's where you kind of feel like the level of threat is manageable. A hurricane scenario means that there's really an immediate threat and you need to take action. This could be anything from if you think there's a domestic abuse issue, if you think someone's suicidal, if you think someone is having a heart attack or has overdosed or anything like that. We're not clinicians and we're not here to intervene as far as providing therapy for folks, but there are good Samaritan laws. If you think someone's in danger, you can call 911. So checking in with your research team, we talked about holding space and immediate action. These are some things that, if you using your intuition and just, your empathy and your humanity, if you notice any of these things, these are things to pay attention to. If someone's crying or their voice is shaking, if they seem really emotionally distraught, if they have rapid or confusing speech, if they have agitation, closed body language, if they're oversharing things that are really personal and off topic, those are all things that could indicate emotional overwhelm. And you can ask folks if they need to take a break or anything like that. So this is ways to respond, pause, lead with empathy, listen carefully. Don't skim over things. If people say something really upsetting, acknowledge it. You make sure that they're comfortable talking about the subject, gently probe for clarity if you need to. Especially if someone's saying, I wish I just wasn't here anymore. I'd be better off dead. Really pay attention to that. Don't gloss over it and don't assume it's a turn of phrase. Say, can you tell me more about that? So, the other thing with autonomy in the 4 pillars, make sure that they're able to take a break if they need to. If they say, I can tell that this is getting emotional and I want to respect your energy and your time. Let me know if you need a break. If you need to get a glass of water or take a few deep breaths, we can pause if we need to. And the other thing with, pausing as well is this idea of therapeutic silence. Sometimes just people need to feel like somebody's there and they aren't alone. So it's okay to just sit and listen sometimes. And sometimes when these things happen, when it gets really emotional, you may not get the data that you need for the interview. And this is when, over recruiting comes into play and it's better to have backups, but sometimes it's okay to just sit and listen to folks. So again, if someone's sharing a traumatic experience, you always want to actively listen and, make sure that you're leading with empathy. You're acknowledging what's going on and you're normalizing it. And some sound bites that you can use here that I find really helpful is, for leading with empathy, you can say things like, please let me know if, you need to take a break. It's totally up to you if you want to continue talking about this or move on to the next topic. Acknowledgement, again, say, I understand this is a sensitive topic, and it's up to you if you want to continue this conversation. So those are some ways that you can really, just honor people again in that moment. Another thing to think about too is these sound bites. Like, I've listed them out here specifically because sometimes when we're in those situations, we might be at a loss for words, especially if we're empathizing and really feeling something with someone. It may be hard. So, just saying, I'm listening, tell me more about that. I can hear the emotion in your voice. If I hear what you're saying, and if that happened to me, I would feel the same way. I think anyone would feel that way. And especially for normalizing and showing compassion, we don't want to taint the data and put words in anyone's mouth, and we don't want to steer the conversation, but it's okay to validate people's feelings. And it's okay to say, I'm so sorry you've gone through that. Do you have someone to talk, to about that? And you can kind of gauge and use your intuition to see how comfortable people are with that. So this is a case study where there was a man that was very distraught about the death of his daughter. And he came up during the interview, he started crying, and we just saved space and listened to him. We did not move forward with our interview questions because it was clear that he wasn't in the headspace to be able to talk about anything else. And we held space for that gentleman. I don't think we changed his life, but we were there for him in a time when he needed some human connection. And it was okay for us to do that because we did not prioritize our business goals and asking questions over his need for empathy and compassion. Now, responding to inappropriate behavior is a bit different. So, this is when you don't want to hold space. You want to check in with yourself here. This is, not about making other people comfortable as much as it is not letting things escalate. So, when you're thinking about what's inappropriate, it's, anything that's verbally aggressive, insulting, if anybody's making sexual remarks, if they're saying anything racist, if they're just, being belligerent and rude in any way, anything that really makes you feel uncomfortable in any way could be considered inappropriate. If they're, just even unwilling to answer questions and not really able to participate, if you think that they're intoxicated in any way, these are all different scenarios that have to be navigated differently. The things that you want to think about really is, are any of these threats, if anyone's making threats, are they founded in anything? And how can I de-escalate and disengage if this person can't calm down? So that's up to you. If you think that there's a part of the conversation where, I don't know, maybe just somebody got really upset about a customer service experience that they had or something, and they're like, cussing and just really agitated and emotionally charged because they're reliving that horrible experience. But you can say, okay, I understand that sounds like that was really, really frustrating. Like, can we, is it okay if we move on to the next topic? And, I hear you and I want to acknowledge that and validate you. And I will, maybe take up some airtime in acknowledging and validating their experience and saying, that's awful. I'm so sorry that happened. But, not letting things continue to escalate and move up higher. And if anyone is inappropriate, make sure that you have your note taker, should be documenting everything in real time, but really for anything inappropriate, you definitely want to make sure that they are documenting it. So, You're the authority on your comfort level and your boundaries. Do not feel obligated to stay in a conversation if you're uncomfortable. And there's a lot of different ways you can address inappropriate behavior. So my favorite formula, if I think the person is able to, be open and receptive to this type of feedback, acknowledge it. Hey, it's interesting you bring that up. It doesn't really have anything what we're here to do with what we're here to talk about, and redirect. Let's get back to the questions that we have planned for today, and a warning. If you mention that again, we're going to have to end this conversation. So that's one way to set a boundary, but sometimes people are too inappropriate and you just have to shut it down. So you can also just acknowledge and call out the behavior and end the call without redirecting. You can just say, that kind of language isn't acceptable and we're going to need to end this conversation. Thank you so much for your time. Or if it's too much that, even acknowledging it isn't an option, you can just bow out and just say, those are all the questions we have for you today. Our interview's over. Thank you so much for your time. And this is something you can talk about with your interview team. Like I said in the beginning, if you feel like you're in a position of freeze or fawning, in a kind of a fight or flight response, it's okay for other people on your interview team to chime in. You need to buy yourself some more time in any way, whether it's someone that's being inappropriate or something came up and you don't know how to address it. If you are virtual, you can maybe feign technical difficulties and say, hey, wait a minute, I think we lost audio, or whatever the case may be. But if you notice that your moderator is having a hard time responding, anyone can step in and set a boundary to ensure the safety of the research team. This is a case study of someone that was intoxicated. And again, if someone's intoxicated, they're not, they might not be capable of actually giving you honest feedback and answers. And, it may not be ethical to have an interview with someone that you feel is potentially intoxicated. So that's something to gauge. For social determinants of health, this is if you think that someone it has a lack of something. It could be neglect or abuse, hoarding, food insecurity, lack of access to transportation or reliable shelter, healthcare, if they've got like clean water and electricity. If you think that they are just in an unsafe environment of some way. Again, we're not here to offer benefits in healthcare. We're not clinicians. But if these types of things come up, you can ask for clarity, depending on what your organization is that you work with and what type of resources you have. My company has a behavioral health team, so I can do some behind the scenes referrals and escalations. But if you ever believe that anyone is in danger, in any immediate type of danger, it is okay to call 911. And there's different ways to think about how to do that. If it's appropriate to notify the person, and that you are calling 911, and sometimes it's safer not to notify them. So we'll go through that. Especially if you're responding to domestic abuse concerns. This one's a really big one. You have to tread very, very lightly and use a lot of discernment on how to proceed, because you could potentially be putting the person in more danger if their abuser suspects that they're being talked about. So typically in research, we ask open-ended, non-leading questions. If you think someone's in danger and they're with another person that could potentially harm them, you ask yes or no closed-ended questions. So are you safe right now? Are you able to talk right now? Would you prefer we call back at another time? Just be mindful and be careful that your conversation could escalate things. And this is where we really have to use our intuition and our instincts and proceed with caution around that. If you can ask them if they've shared their experience with anyone else, if they have a social worker or a support network. You definitely want to make sure your note taker is documenting everything. But if the person is not comfortable talking, you shut it down and end the conversation. Do not push it. If you think they appear to be in an abusive environment and you fear for them after the call has ended, you can call 911 on their behalf if needed. We definitely do not want to escalate anything in that type of a situation. I know that for my research in my company, we always have the participant's address on hand. So that's something that I would have in front of me with my screener. And I would always have that in front of me to begin with to build rapport. But again, it might be needed for that as well, depending on your research protocols and your organization. You're likely to have their address as well if in the event that you potentially need to call 911. Now, responding to mental health concerns, this is different because it's more around how to gauge if you think someone is really a harm to themselves or others, and how to be there and hold space for people. But if you think that they might need additional support, there are ways that you can potentially go about doing that within the context of research without overstepping your boundaries. So some of these mental health concerns listed, grief, paranoia, suicide ideation, homicidal ideation, self-harm, panic attacks, social isolation and loneliness is very big with senior citizens. And a lot of people that have been homebound since COVID. Any kind of drug use, abuse, dependence, addiction. People might express thoughts of depression or anxiety. And when people are very inappropriate and get very aggressive, that might potentially indicate a serious mental illness. So if you come against any of those types of topics, the most sensitive one is suicide ideation. So gently probe for clarity. If you think it's a turn of phrase, don't slough it off. Just say, oh, can you say more about that? Like, how does, what do you mean when you say, sometimes I wish I weren't here anymore? What is, really kind of say, just get them to explain whether or not they're being hyperbolic, and get a feel for if they really feel that way, or if it's a turn of phrase. But take it seriously, because it could be serious and you never know. So responding to mental health concerns, you're going to listen attentively, normalize everything. If they're suicidal, make sure that you're being very sensitive to that. If you think they may be in need of a counselor, there are ways to offer those resources. And there's really specific things that you need to think about here. So if somebody admitted that they overdosed, you stay on the line with them, have somebody call 911. Don't tell them that you're calling. If you think that notifying the person that calling 911 might inspire them to flee and put them in more danger, then don't share it with them. If it's something like a health concern, like if someone says, I'm having chest pains and I'm afraid, then you can say, we'll call 911 for you. But if you think that they may flee, then don't take that risk, because they could, get behind the wheel of a car, or, you never know. Also, I just realized we have 10 minutes, you all. I'm so sorry. Okay, so I'm going to skip through this case study. So this is offering resources and escalations. So again, we talked about kind of calling 911. This is how to gauge interest if you want to offer therapy potentially. We do not want to imply like you need professional help. That could be really offensive to someone. That could be triggering to someone. So use your intuition and be very careful. We're allies, but we're researchers and we have to stay in our lane. So you can say things like, it was an honor to listen to you, your story today. If you want to talk to someone else in the future about some of the topics that came up today, I'd be happy to give you a number. Or, are you interested in a phone number for someone else to speak with about some of the things that came up today? Kind of feel them out before you just say, hey, I feel like you need to talk to a therapist. Let me give you this phone number. Really, be sensitive to the fact that these people someone just opened up to you and they felt safe and secure with you, sharing with you. They might not feel like they want to share that with other people. But a lot of times you can tell if people are lonely and they really feel like they need someone to talk to. Um, you know, there are resources to offer them. So the suicide hotline is nationwide. Anyone can call. It's 24/7. 988 is another nationwide texting code right now for suicide, which is great. If people can't talk on the phone, they can text this number. 211 is a great directory for anybody that needs resources for getting help paying bills or finding food. You know, that's like if anybody has a social determinant of health need, if you feel like they need food or housing, there's some type of an emergency, this can help them. And then the friendship line, it's a crisis intervention and warm line for just daily phone calls. They can provide emotional support, medication reminders. Um, it can just be a place where people can go if they are lonely or isolated, if they're grieving, if they're depressed, or if they're thinking about death or suicide, or if they just need human connection on a regular basis. The only thing that I find unfortunate about this is it's open to people age 60 or older, caregivers and adults living with disabilities. Not really sure why it's limited to that. I'm not sure if they would turn someone down if they called. I've never tried. But that is, you know, something to consider. And that is about it. I think I'm going to go kind of, yeah, those were, we talked about calling 911. And again, self-care as researchers, just to think about your yourself and your emotional health and well-being, and making sure that you have the time and space to take care of yourself, put your own oxygen mask on first, you know, debrief after your interviews, talk to your teammates about what came up, how it made you feel, how you would, you know, do things differently if something like that came up again in the future. Make sure that you guys are all supporting each other. Take those breaks. You know, if you need to talk to somebody, my company has an EAP, an employee assistance program, so we can talk to therapists if we need to. Just be, you know, mindful of keeping participants' names confidential if you are confiding in people about the conversations that you're having with folks. And again, remember, empathy is a superpower. We're made to feel and connect with other people. And research is how this comes to life in our work. So tapping on our sense of empathy for our members is what makes our design method grounded and human-centered, but it can also take a toll on us emotionally too. So be mindful of that and take care of yourself. You know, people can get compassion fatigue and burnout. And this is something to normalize, having these conversations with your coworkers around taking care of yourselves and navigating these conversations with folks. If you feel triggered during an interview, again, check in with your research team and do what's right for you. It's okay. We're all human. We all have feelings. And, you know, this is a tool to help you kind of think about how you might need to address issues directly, or how you might need to step away. And that is the end.